Welcome to the new JFK Show, number 186, with Dr. Ralph K, Dr. James Fetzer, Larry Rivera, and myself, Gary King. We're over here at 153 News. We've been terminated from YouTube, and even my guitar channel that I only reviewed guitars couldn't be any more G-rated than that has been terminated. It's just
get rid of subversives.
Yeah, I mean, all right. So, fellas, so I understand you guys are going to Washington, D.C. tomorrow for some type of JFK conference. Can y'all talk about that? And then we're going to go straight to Rouse and K with some stuff about Jack Ruby. And I can
That's called The Big Event. It's sponsored by David Denton and Ed Tatro. Lorian Fenton has organized it. It's going to be at the Holiday Inn Express at the Dulles International Airport. Larry will be speaking on Saturday. I will be speaking on Sunday. Larry will be talking about new document releases. I'll be talking about the Zapruder film.
Yeah, I like David Denton a lot. I saw him many, many years ago when I first started my JFK journey right there at the Aldorfus Hotel. And Ed Tatro didn't want to talk to me. He wouldn't go on the record. I had a radio show, but he said, oh, David Denton over there will do it. You know, so he gave me a very good interview, and we've all come a long, long way since then. In fact, I remember Larry Rivera was proud that Doug Horn even mentioned his name. So that's coming a long, long ways from that time that I was actually at the David Denton conference, and I had to call Larry. I said, Larry, Doug Horn just mentioned your name in his research about the Zapruder film being altered, and that was a big deal for Larry. So look how far Larry has come since then.
Well, I'll tell you, I got to issue a major apologia because Larry's book was supposed to be available at this conference. I told him he could count on it, and it turned out to be so massive we had to contemplate putting it in 2 volumes. Now it was double space, so our composer is going back and doing it single space. It'll probably be the largest single volume book we ever publish, coming in just under 600 pages, chock full with all kinds of brilliant stuff.
Wow. It takes 600 pages to slaughter the Warren Commission like Larry's going to do. I really predict it's the best book on JFK in one volume, especially with 600 pages. So it's on. So I got a sub list waiting on it. So we're really excited about that. So anything else about the conference? Are you ready to get on with Ralph?
Well, it's quite a good lineup of speakers. I think it'll be an excellent conference, depending on how the weather affects things. Larry called me to confirm that everything was a go. I spoke with Lorian today, and she affirmed the same. So we'll see how it plays out, but I think it's going to be a very successful event.
Yeah, my parents are already there.
Terrific.
Yeah. Did you talk to Lauren about the UFO research?
Yes, I did. Gary. Thank you. Yes.
Whenever. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up
thank you.
our screen share, and we'll start with Ralph, Dr. Ralph K.
All right, thank you.
And
all right, we're going to be talking. Am I being heard okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'm going to be showing you some images tonight. I want to say, first of all, that most of what I'm showing you actually came from Amy Joyce, one of our members, and also the man whom I referred to as the Wizard. So a lot of this is their work, and some very good work, and it concerns Jack Ruby. We've made more progress, starting with this image here. Now, this is a famous image. This is supposed to be Jack Ruby at the Dallas Police Department on Friday, November 22nd. This was when he was stalking Oswald. And I've heard it reported as 2 different times. I've heard it say that this was at the midnight press conference. And I remember watching a program on ABC with Peter Jennings in which he referred to this as Friday afternoon. So I've seen it referred to both ways. But actually, both of those claims are false. You see that newspaper in the background that man is reading. Well, Amy Joyce got the bright idea of finding out exactly what paper that was and the date of it. And so please go to the next frame.
Yeah.
Whoops. Go to the next frame. All right, that's the one I wanted. Well, you can't read it here, but when you blow it up, go to the next frame. Oh, here it is. It says Dallas, Texas, Saturday, November 23rd, 1963. So this was actually a Saturday newspaper, which means that that photo was taken not on Friday, not Friday afternoon, not Friday night, but Saturday. Now, it's important because, of course, I've been claiming for a long time that that guy was not Jack Ruby, and I still think he was not Jack Ruby. But now it turns out it wasn't even Friday afternoon or evening, and it was Saturday. And the fact is that Jack Ruby never even went to the Dallas Police Department on Saturday. Now, I want to make something very clear here that you know how there are a lot of phony Oswald sightings, like Oswald went to a firing range, and that he was actually firing diagonally at other people's targets.
Yeah, driving a car from a dealership, crazy.
Went to a car dealership and was speeding on the freeway.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of phony Oswald sightings. Well, likewise, there are a lot of phony Ruby sightings, and this is an example of a phony Ruby sighting. And he did not go to the Dallas Police Department at all on Saturday. And I think that the best witness to that is Ruby himself, because we always have to remember that Ruby accepted that he shot Oswald. He didn't deny it. He was told that he did it, and he didn't dispute it. He assumed that since they're telling him he did, he must have done it. So as long as he was accepting that, there's no reason to think that he would lie about whether he went to the police station on Saturday. So the fact that he insisted, no, I didn't go there on Saturday, I think should be taken very seriously. There's really no reason to doubt him. And if you look at the record of what he did, you realize there was no room for it anyway, because he was actually up all night Friday night, and that is into the wee hours on Saturday. He didn't go to bed Friday night until Saturday morning at 6 or 7 a.m. And then he slept until just about noon. And then he got up and he made some calls and he went to the Carousel Club. And then he went to Dealey Plaza and he wanted to see the wreaths that were put out for Kennedy. But he never went to the Dallas Police Department. So there's really no chance that that guy on the left was Jack Ruby, and it was definitely taken on Saturday and not Friday. Now, the reason I put this image up is because the image on the right is you might say, a brand new image of Jack Ruby. When I say brand new, I mean it's as recent as this year. It was never seen until a few months ago. It was taken from a parade in Dallas that occurred in 1960. And I don't know exactly how they realized that he was in it, but there's a few seconds of him, and it does appear to be him. Again, it's from 1960. And what you see him doing is a very peculiar thing, in my opinion. You see him wearing that hat there. Well, what he does is he takes the hat off, and then he takes a comb, and he combs the little bit of hair that he had. And then he puts the hat back on. That's what he's doing there. He's putting the hat back on after combing his hair. But, I have to wonder, first of all, if he's wearing a hat, why does he have to worry about whether his hair is combed? And secondly, if he's going to comb his hair and put his hat back on, well, obviously the hat is going to mess up the hair. So it just seems like a very eccentric activity to me to be doing that. But that's what he did.
Ralph, frankly, of those two pictures, I would have thought the guy on the left was Ruby and the guy on the right is not. I mean,
okay, but that is the exact opposite of the case. So the guy on the right is Ruby and the guy on the left is not. But the reason I put this image up is because I want you to compare their noses. The guy on the right, Ruby, as you can see, he did not have a sunken nasal tip. He did not have a hook nose. He had in the field, they refer to it as having good tip elevation. He did have good tip elevation. There was nothing sunken about the tip of his nose. Whereas the guy on the left, on our left, has got a nose like a bird. It's very hooked. It's a very Roman nose. It's very curved down, and they're very, very different. And there's really no way that those two men could be the same man. And there's another interesting thing is this. And this was only put forward recently by Randy Gunter, who's another one of our members, and he's very prominent on Facebook. But when you look at that image, it looks from this distance as though there's a little tuft of hair on top of the head of the man on the left. But actually what we're seeing there is the very top of the head and the hair of the man in the jacket that's standing deep to him. And so this particular man is really just about completely bald on top. And there's really no way that he could have been Jack Ruby. So the thing that I'm left with as a puzzlement is to wonder what really happened here. Was this a case in which there was a man there that just happened to look kind of sort of like Ruby and they decided afterwards to declare that he was Ruby? Or is this somebody that they groomed to be a Ruby double and placed there?
Doppelganger.
And I'm more inclined to think that it's a Ruby double that they placed there. And it's a very spooky thing if it's true, because you know how they had Oswald doubles? Well, if they had this Ruby double that was in the works for a while, it means that they had plans for him way before the assassination. Perhaps they didn't know what they were going to use him for, but they definitely had plans to frame him. They had patsy plans for him that went back months or longer. So,
well, just to review the bidding, how did you establish the fellow on the right is the real Jack Ruby?
Well, we have other images that are very satisfactory in comparison to him there. And I have another image of him there that I'm going to show you that I also think is quite compelling.
Have you ever thought of running these past Beverly Oliver, who of course knew Jack Ruby?
Well, no, I never thought of that. Go to the next one now. Okay, go to the next. All right, now the next. All right, now this is a very important thing to me. This is taken from a narrative, you might say a diary that Ruby wrote. And he wrote this after he was tried and after he was convicted and after he was sentenced to death. It's basically, it was an autobiography, really. And the weird thing is they got a professional writer to help him. The man's name was William Reed Woodfield. Have you ever heard of him, Jim?
No.
Okay, well, he was a prominent television screenwriter. He wrote a lot of TV shows. Probably the most famous one that he wrote was Mission Impossible. Remember? Da, 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 da,
yes. Well, I know the show.
You know, that spy show. He wrote the, and then Tom Cruise ended up making several movie versions of it. But the original Mission Impossible was written by this guy, William Reed Woodfield. And they brought him in to help Ruby write his story, which I think is weird. I have to wonder who did it. I mean, did Ruby's lawyers do it? I can't imagine that they would have done it. So somebody, I think, on the other side did it. So anyway, he's talking about what happened on that Sunday morning. So he says, I reached the bottom of the ramp. He's speaking now, being there at the site of the Oswald shooting. I didn't see anyone I knew. I put my hands into my pocket to be comfortable, and I walked to get a closer view of whatever was going to happen. Suddenly, there was a great commotion. Out walked Oswald. He was about 10 feet from me. He came out all of a sudden with a smirky, defiant, cursing, vicious expression on his face. Now, I want to stop for a second and point out that I don't think there's anything realistic about that description of Oswald there or anywhere else that we saw him. He wasn't vicious. He wasn't defiant. He certainly wasn't cursing. So I think in a way, Ruby was reading just from his own imagination into what he claims to have seen on Oswald. And then he said, I can't convey what impressions he gave me. There was no one standing by me. Suddenly this person pops out, meaning Oswald. And then he says this is Ruby. I must have pulled out my gun and taken a couple of steps. Now, when a person says an expression that I must have done something, what they're really doing is expressing doubt that they did it. Because if they knew they did it, he would have just said matter-of-factly, I pulled out my gun and took a couple of steps. By couching it in that kind of expression, I must have done it, means that, well, they told me I did it, so I must have done it, but he's not really aware of having done it. And was his story always from beginning to end. It says, the police, could have blown my head off. I only shot him once. This was at 11:20, 3 minutes after the time of the wire. Now, that's a parenthetical expression, and I have a feeling that Mr. Westfield probably wrote it. I mean, I doubt that Ruby would have written it. And then he says, I had no thought of doing any violence to anyone when I went down there. I didn't even think about it. And I want you to think about something that I think is very supportive of that. And that is that if Jack Ruby had any intention of shooting Oswald, he certainly would have showed up on time. The only time ever given was 10 a.m. And when it didn't happen at 10 a.m., there was no advisement. They didn't give any update. They didn't say, all right, it's going to happen now at 11 o'clock or 11:15. They didn't say anything. It was just all in the dark. So there's no way that anybody could have tipped Ruby off to come at 11:20 because nobody would have known. They simply gave no advisement. The reporters were waiting, but they really had no idea when he was going to show up, and they were just going to wait until he did. So there's really no way that Ruby could have known in advance that that Oswald was going to be brought out at 11:20. And I'll tell you something else. If it's your intention to shoot someone to death, and you know it's going to happen at a certain time, not only are you going to get there on time, but you're probably going to get there a little bit early because, you know, things can go wrong. You could get stuck in traffic. You're going to, you know, just like when you catch a flight, you don't show up 2 minutes before the flight. You get there early. Well, it's the same way if you're going to shoot somebody. So if he thought that Oswald was going to be shot at 10, certainly he would have gotten there by, say, 9:45, maybe even 9:30. So the fact that he came waltzing in at 11:20 tells you that he had no intention of shooting Oswald. So then he says after that, the only thing he can remember is being down on the floor. And I said to the police, you don't have to beat me. You don't have to beat my brains out. I'm Jack Ruby. What am I doing here? What are you guys jumping on me for? Why am I here? I'm Jack Ruby. I'm not somebody that's wanted. Now, whether he really said all that, well, if he did say all that, the guy in the garage certainly didn't say all that because we can see it. There's audio in the garage. If he said all that, we'd see him speaking. We'd presumably hear him speaking. At least we'd see his mouth moving that he was talking, and the shooter never spoke that we can see. So, but the fact that Ruby would say all those things demonstrates that he was not aware of having done anything wrong. As far as he knew at that time, the police were jumping on him for no reason of which he was aware. And then
so they just jumped him? They just jumped him?
They dragged me into the elevator. They brought me upstairs. They told me I shot Oswald. That was the first time I realized what I had done. And I said, oh, my God, oh, my God. All right, so that's the end of that. But, you know, this is a very, very peculiar thing because if any one of us were in a situation where we went somewhere knowing we hadn't done anything, and then the police jumped us and told us, you know, you shot that guy. There is absolutely nothing that they could say that would convince us that we did it if we knew we didn't do it. And it wouldn't matter if there was 100 of them telling us that we shot the guy or 1,000. Any one of us, if we knew we didn't do it, we would say, you are all full of shit. I didn't shoot anybody. We would never budge. We would never relent on that. Because we have confidence in our own cognitive ability. We wouldn't doubt ourselves. And not only that, but we would also know that we're not a person who would just go up and shoot somebody. It's just not who we are. It's impossible that we could behave that way, and we would never give an inch on it. So the fact that Ruby allowed anybody to talk him into thinking that he shot Oswald just shows you how weak he was in his mind, you know, his ability to reason. It was very, very compromised. All right, go to the next frame, please. All right, I brought you this because this is how the story of his narrative was titled. They told me I shot Oswald. I mean, I'm almost surprised that they allowed that to be the title of the story, and because it just emphasizes the fact that Jack Ruby had no memory of having shot Oswald. He had no awareness of doing it. And the only reason he came to accept that he did it is because he worshiped the Dallas police so much that if they told him he did it, he just couldn't suspect them of lying. And so therefore he accepted that he did it. But it's a very, very strange thing. And I'll tell you something else that's strange. This case that I've described of Ruby being unaware that he shot Oswald and not finding out until afterwards is basically the basis for what the defense did for him at the trial. They basically said that he had no awareness that he did it, but he was basically unconscious at the time. It's like he was in a trance or he was in just a sleepwalk kind of state. And therefore, he had no moral responsibility for doing it because he wasn't even aware he was doing it. It was like a robot. Well, that argument was attacked by the prosecutor, Henry Wade, and he successfully got the jury to ignore it and to refuse to believe it. He basically told the jury that, no, Ruby did this with full intent, full awareness. He made up his mind that he was going to shoot Oswald, and he did it. And that's the basis on which they sentenced Ruby to death. However, after the trial was long over, it came to be accepted that what Ruby claimed was true, even as early as 1978, when they made the TV movie called Ruby and Oswald. The way it was presented in the story was that Ruby goes into kind of a altered state, and they even had the actor kind of quivering his mouth like he was in some kind of trance, and then he goes and shoots Oswald. And then as they're taking him upstairs, the police tell him in the elevator, you know, you shot Oswald. And he acts, what? Me? I shot Oswald? I mean, he acted like he was all surprised. And they presented that as a factual telling of what happened. So I think it's very interesting and kind of chilling in a way that the argument that they defeated at trial and got, you know, Ruby sentenced to death is the one that became the official story afterwards, that he really did it unconsciously. All right, keep going. Let's go to the next image. All right, now I'm changing the subject here. This is kind of an interesting thing. And I forget now, I think it might have been the wizard who actually made this observation. But I want you to compare these two images. Notice on the left that you've got this air conditioning duct, and it's crossing across the top of the ceiling. But it is inset from the corner. It's, I don't know, a foot or maybe 18 inches deep to the corner. He's got a little arrow there, a red arrow, that indicates where the corner of the building is there. And then further in, you can see where a larger arrow is pointing to the edge. And then above it, you see the arrow with two points. And that shows you the span between the corner and where the air conditioning duct appears to be. But in the image on the right, you can see that the air conditioning duct looks flush with the corner of the building. So this is a contradiction. It's a dichotomy. They both can't be true. And we believe that the one on the right is the one that represents the actual accurate condition in that hallway, and the one on the left is a false representation. Now the question is, why did they do it? Why would they fake a thing like this? Well, first of all, let me say that in the discussions I had with with the wizard and with Amy Joyce, and they're the ones that really devoted the time to this, and I wish that Amy could have been here tonight. I know she wanted to be. But we decided that we really don't have an entirely firm explanation for why they did it, but we have a speculative one, and I'm going to explain it to you. And that is, it concerns some of the detectives who were standing on the other side of the cubbyhole here, particularly this Detective Lowry, and then the one next to him, Detective Combest. They were actually standing, and they were facing the Main Street ramp from which Ruby came down. So the question arose that they should have seen Ruby when he was coming down. And so they needed to be an explanation as to why they didn't see him because they didn't claim to see him. Lowry claimed that he didn't see Ruby until he bolted to shoot Oswald. So he only saw him a second or so before the shot actually went off. That's what he claimed. He didn't lay eyes on him prior to that. Go to the next image for me, please, Gary.
So is this the door that they let Oswald out of?
Yeah, that's the door that they brought Oswald. It's the same door on the right here. This image is framed more, is cropped more than this one. But yeah, this is the door that they came out. And I'll tell you another weird thing before you change it, and you can tell me what you think about it. But there's absolutely no doubt that Oswald was let out that side door. Not through the double doors, but through the side door. Fritz came out that door, and then a few seconds later, the detective Lavelle and his partner Graves, the trio of them and Oswald came out that side door. But the times that Jim Lavelle has put on a demonstration of, you might say, a reenactment of what happened, he has led the Oswald subject out the double doors. It's almost like he forgot that he came out the side door. And that has happened multiple times, that he has used that they've used the double door. In fact, the last time they did it was when Gary Mack was still alive, and they put on a reenactment of the Oswald shooting. And so they had the real James Lavelle there, and they had somebody who was, representing Oswald, and they had somebody who was representing Graves. And they all came marching out the double doors. Now, you would think a guy like Gary Mack, supposed to be a researcher, practically an historian of the assassination, supposedly one of the most well-read people that there was, and somebody who was supposed to be very, very familiar with all the images and all the movies. Well, how could he not realize that they came out the side door? It was really kind of ridiculous that they did it that way, but that's how they did it. And then what they did was something that I think was even more ridiculous. There were lights, and one of the excuses that people gave for why they didn't see Ruby is because of the blinding lights of all the television cameras. Well, when we see the films, we watch the various footages, the NBC footage, the KRLD footage, and the other footages, we can see how light they were, and they weren't that bright. They weren't that bright. But when they filmed it that day, they had all these very heavy, heavy flashes, and they made it so blinding that, yeah, you couldn't see anything. But that was not an accurate, duplication of what had happened anyway. So that was another false thing that I can attribute to Gary Mack. All right, go to the next.
Ralph, before we go, the angle's not exactly the same, mind you. I'm wondering whether both photographs could be accurate from their perspective.
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't really think so, Jim. I'll tell you why, because there was actually a little bit of an abutment that you can see in both images, and it appears as a vertical line. Now, there's nothing I can do to point to it, but if you, in other words, you've got the wall coming that is flush with the door, and then it reaches an abutment where there's a little bit of a projection, and it appears to us as a line, and you can see it in both images, a vertical line, and then you get to the corner, and then when you get to the corner, of course, it goes around the corner, and but the one who drew this was the Wizard, and I do, having seen it larger, I can tell you that he did do it accurately, that where the little red arrow is the corner, and it corresponds to the one red arrow that we see on this side. Anyway, go to the next image, if you would. All right, this is another image I just want to demonstrate, and again, this is the work of the Wizard. This is the UPI ABC film, and you can see here that the air conditioning duct is perfectly flush with the corner. And you can see the abutment in this one too. Again, it's very faint here, but there's a little bit of a vertical line because there was just a piece that sort of jutted out a little bit from the rest of the wall, and it appears to us as a very, very faint line. But so anyway, the air conditioning duct definitely was at the corner. It was not inset. Go to the next image, if you would. All right, now I want to read this testimony. This was the testimony of Lowry, and this is the reason I think why the Wizard and Amy Joy started thinking that they may have messed with that because they were interested in using that air conditioning duct as an alibi for this guy not seeing Ruby when he came down the ramp. So he says, the investigator says, "Did you see anybody coming down?" And he's referring to the Main Street ramp. He says, "No, sir. If you will notice this," indicating there's an offset here. So he even used the word offset, Jim. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And from my position, I would only see a short distance up the ramp. And there's also a drop-down air conditioning central heating unit back in here that if my view hadn't been obstructed on that side, I would have been able to see, I was unable to see more than a few feet up the ramp. Now it's not true. We've looked at images from that angle, and really he could see, if not all the way, most of the way up the ramp. So what he said wasn't true. I understand from your statement, this is the investigator again. I understand from your statement that you could not have seen their faces as they came down the ramp because of the obstruction. But you could have seen their feet, couldn't you? And he wasn't even me. I mean, in other words, okay, so you got this air conditioning thing, but it wasn't blocking the feet. So Lowry says, no, I wouldn't be able to. I didn't see anybody coming down the ramp. They could have possibly gotten down there without me seeing them, but I didn't see any feet or any person coming down the ramp at all. And again, I didn't bring it, but we have an image which shows the ramp, and from where he was standing at that corner, he certainly would have seen. So as far as I'm concerned, this is all excuse making. This is all just a big alibi for basically making up an excuse or reason why he didn't see Ruby when he came down the ramp. Anyway, you go on to the next image. All right, Jim, this gets us back to that image I showed at the beginning, and you asked about Ruby and whether this was really Jack Ruby. It's from WFAA. That's the local, I think it's an ABC affiliate, and they're still going today there in Dallas. And I remember I said to you that what he does at this parade, and I don't know exactly when in 1960 it was. If it was, say, in the spring, I'm sure it wasn't, I doubt it was in the winter, but it was in the spring, that would have meant that it was 3.5 years before the assassination. And I remember when I said that what he does is he's standing there, he's wearing a hat, and then he takes the hat off just for the purpose of combing his hair, and then he very, very carefully puts the hat back on. So he's holding the comb in his hand there, and he's combing his hair. But what this shows that is so important is just how little hair he had. Notice how much scalp you're seeing on top of his head. He had a few long strands that he combed back. You know, I often make a joke about this, that you hear about men having a comb over, where they're taking hair from the side and combing it over this way or this way.
Netanyahu.
Well, he happened to have a few strands in front, and he was basically bald entirely behind it. And so he had a comb back. So he let his few strands in front grow very long, and he would just comb them back to try to cover up as much scalp as he could. But as you can see there, he's got a lot of daylight, and there really is not much hair at all on the top of his head. But the other thing I want you to think about is the fact that this was 1960, and it was 3.5 years before. And a man can lose a lot of hair if he's in the direction of losing hair, and Ruby was. that in 3.5 years, he can get a lot bolder than he was. So 3.5 years later, he can be a lot bolder. We know that was true of Billy Lovelady. When we look at the picture of Billy Lovelady from the 1950s, which they claim to be from 1959, and we compare the amount of hair he had at the time of the assassination, he lost a lot of hair in 3.5 years. And so, in other words, if this is as little as hair Ruby had in 1960, well, he certainly had less and not more in 1963. So he really was quite bald. He really didn't have a whole heck of a lot of hair. All right, so go to the next image.
Yep. Well, that sure looks like Bill Newman right there, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. All right, now this is an image of Jack Ruby from his trial. I don't know, he's standing there with one of his lawyers. And if you look at that picture, you certainly get the impression that he's got some of that temporal diamond shape to his hair. But other than that, he looks like he's got good coverage all across the top of his head. And it is certainly a gross exaggeration of the amount of hair he had. So there was a policy throughout the U.S. media to depict Jack Ruby with more hair than he had. And I'm going to get to the reason why later. And it's only a speculation, but it is weird. And it's also very chilling to think about how widespread the practice was of showing Jack Ruby with more hair. It makes me think that even back then that the CIA, or at least the U.S. intelligence community, had people planted throughout the U.S. media, basically at every major newspaper, that they had their people controlling content, controlling images, and making sure that, the right story and the right message was being sent. And I suspect, if anything, it's worse today than it was then, but it was even bad then. All right, go to the next image. All right, here's another image. That's supposed to be Jack Ruby. And again, look at his hair. It seems a little receded, but yet beyond the recession, it looks like thick carpeted hair. You really get the sense that he had a lot of hair up there. And it is much, 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 much more than he actually had. This is another example of an image showing Jack Ruby with much more hair than he had. Okay, go to the next one.
No, wait a minute. Yeah. You think that nose is the same as the guy with the very straight nose before, no hook here?
Yeah, I'm satisfied. Even though, his nose looks bulbous, it's not actually hooked, though. There's not really any descent there. It's basically, it's still considered an elevated tip. So no, I'm satisfied that that's his nose, and that's about how it was. All right, go to the next image, please. All right, now I put this up again just to remind you that even at the time they were depicting him as being practically bald, and yet later on, supposedly, at his trial, he suddenly has all this hair on his head. So in a way, they're contradicting themselves, that they would think that this guy with the hook nose and no hair on top was Jack Ruby, and then showing later this good coverage. Go to the next image. You'll see again what I mean. All right, this is probably, you might say, the most outrageous image of all in terms of showing Jack Ruby with a ridiculous amount of hair, which he most certainly didn't have. That really looks almost like a toupee. And again, this was art that was done to the thing. They basically drew that in there. And it shows such a dogged determination to show Ruby with a lot of hair. And I really just don't understand. I do understand, but what I mean is I don't understand how they could have the gall to do it. Because surely there were plenty of people who knew Jack Ruby and knew what he looked like. For example, why didn't his own family complain when an image like that was shown? Jack's hair did not look like that. Maybe they did complain in private. But we never heard about them complaining. But that is definitely a false image of Jack Ruby's hair. But anyway, go to the next image, and this one may be the last. This is the image of the shooter from the Jackson photo. And you might say, and in fact, there's no doubt that this is the most famous image of the shooter that there is, because the Jackson photo of the Oswald shooting is the most famous photographic image of the shooting by far. It's more famous than any of the film images. It's more famous than the Beers image. It's more famous than the Johnston image. This is, you might say, the go-to image. It's the poster boy for the entire Oswald shooting. And when you look closely at this image, you're seeing very thick hair in back there, and it's also very long hair. Can you see how that hair is curling up at the bottom? It really looks like a mop. I mean, it really has just a very, very, very thick look. And even though from this distance we can't see it too well, Amy Joyce pointed out that it's even very thick and woolly at the sideburn, and especially for a man of that time, because this is, you know, pre-Beatles, long hair wasn't in yet, and this would have actually been very long hair for a man in 1963. Well, what we suspect is that that's a toupee, that James Bookout, who was an FBI agent, and one thing that we notice is that all of the, not only the FBI agents, but really all of the law enforcement people wore their hair very close cropped. I mean, they all had, you know, kind of athletic haircuts like swimmers, where it was very, very shaved around the ears. And so every single FBI agent, and James Bookout was an FBI agent. And I think that they definitely wanted to move away from that. They didn't want to suggest that the shooter was as very, you know, sharply groomed as an FBI agent. So I think that he wore a hairpiece there, and that's what we're seeing in back and at the sideburn. Every bit of that is phony hair that he was wearing as a wig. But when you see hair that thick and that long, your natural tendency is to presume that he had an equal amount of hair under the hat on top. Usually if a man is completely bald on top, he wouldn't wear the hair around on the sides very long. And furthermore, you know, when a man loses all his hair on top, even though he'll keep his hair around, you know, the ears, that hair will also thin, so it won't be as thick as a mop like you're seeing here on him. So anyway, we're getting the impression in general, even with the hat, that this is a man that had a lot of thick hair, and he had it throughout his head. And that, I think, is the reason why they started doctoring Jack Ruby's hair and making him seem like he had more hair than he did, because they were trying to fulfill the message that came with this photo, that we're looking at a hairy guy here, a guy who had a lot of hair on his head, and that he wore it long, and that it curled up at the bottom. And this is the reason why they had to doctor his hairline and all the images of him that we have. Now, I think that's all the images I sent, right?
That's
well, that, supplement on your previous research on.
All right. Well, I mean, how much time do we have, Gary?
Probably 15 minutes for sure.
All right, good. Well, because, you know, I've been thinking about the whole situation with Ruby. I'd like to just muse a little bit for your listeners and your viewers. I've been thinking about Ruby, and I want to say, first of all, and with no wish of being unkind, that he was not a very smart man. He had very little education, and, you know, he came from a household in which I don't think there were any, you might say, intellectuals. And he was a kind of a seat of his pants kind of a guy. I mean, he was, you know, he was a little bit street savvy, but, you know, he wasn't very smart, and he certainly wasn't educated. And he just wasn't a very good thinker to begin with. But then I think he had some very serious mental problems. And the thing that I'm not sure of is, to what extent were these mental problems the result of the drugs that he was taking, and to what extent, you know, were they just the result of him being him? Because, you know, there are people that have mental illnesses who, you know, they don't necessarily have a history of drug use. They just have a history of mental illness. So it can happen without any drugs at all. But he was a very heavy user of amphetamine type drugs. And on the day of the Oswald shooting, what he claimed was that he took twice his usual dose of amphetamines. And then he said he took like 7 other pills. He never explained what those pills were. And I wonder sometimes if maybe he did explain, but that it was taken out of the narrative that got published. But why would a person say he took 7 more pills and then not tell you what the pills were or the reason why he took them? So it seems to me that they may have edited that, but he took a whole lot of drugs that morning for reasons that we simply don't know. And again, I can only speculate to what extent his mind was impaired by the drugs as opposed to being impaired just by itself. But again, I want to say that on the day of the assassination, Ruby had no awareness of shooting Oswald. They told him afterwards that he did it, and he didn't question it. And the reason he didn't question it is because he loved the Dallas police. Now, when I say he loved the Dallas police, I am quoting him, okay? It's in his narrative in which he says, "I love the Dallas police." And now he said that after they not only, charged him and pounded on him, in the garage there, stripped him to his underwear, and then had a doctor perform a rectal examination on him. Can you imagine that they actually ordered Dr. Bieberdorf, the medical student, 25 years old, to perform a rectal examination on Ruby to just in the event that he stuffed a weapon into his anus, okay? Can you imagine? I mean, and even then you would think, because you would think that just instinctually when they told him, look, we got to examine you, make sure you didn't shove a gun up your butt, that he might have, objected and said, listen, I don't have a gun up there, and, I am not going to cooperate with that. You're going to have to get a warrant from a judge or something because I refuse, okay? If you want to try to get to me, put him up. I mean, I would think that he might have put up some resistance, but he was so docile, so cooperative, and he actually made a joke about it after the exam was done. He actually told the doctor, I got to tell you, that was the worst massage I ever got in my life. And I think it's pretty funny. But anyway, but it goes to show you. And then, at his trial, not only did the officers like Lavelle and Graves and others testify against him that he shot Oswald, but they were giving testimony that he was a homosexual and other things. And even after they said all those things about him, he still was willing to say and to put in print that he loved the Dallas police. So he had a devotion and a dedication to them that the only comparison I could make is that they were like his superheroes. The way a little kid can just, really adore Spider-Man or Batman or some other superhero and wear the costume on Halloween and do, all the kind of stuff like that. Well, basically, that's the way Jack Ruby was towards the Dallas police. And it's an example of what I consider to be his very childlike personality and nature. He was a very, very childlike, immature person. And I think they knew this about him, and they were keenly aware of just how totally enamored with them he was. And I think that somebody, and I don't know who, but somebody must have come up with the idea, if we can get Ruby there, we can just tell him that he shot Oswald. And if we tell him that he did it, he's going to believe us. You see, Ruby, because of two things, because of his tremendous drug use, taking all these amphetamines, and because of his severe sleep deprivation. He was one of those guys that routinely stayed up all night. He would very, very often just catch a couple hours sleep, maybe sleep from, 6 to 9 or something and call it a whole night's sleep. There's a guy named Ken Rohm, R-O-H-M, who's got a website that's called The Timeline of Jack Ruby. And in it, he has collected all of the reports, including Ruby's reports, but also the reports of others, of Ruby's activities during the last 4 days, the Thursday, the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday. And in the course of those 3 nights, Jack Ruby got a total of 7 hours sleep in 3 nights. And that was actually typical of him. He often went, and he was such a chronic insomniac. Now, here's what happens to people who are just who suffer with extreme sleep deprivation. What can happen to them is they can crash. They can just literally suddenly just sort of doze off, or they can just go into a kind of a half sleep-like state in which they're kind of half asleep, half awake, and then they do things, and then later on people tell them, you realize what you did? Yeah, you got up on the table and you were dancing, blah, 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 and the person just has no memory of doing it. And Ruby was used to that. He was used to being told that he did outrageous things at the club in the wee hours of the morning, and being told the next day that he did that, and he would have no memory of doing it. So when they told him that he shot Oswald, he was already used to being told that he did things that he couldn't remember doing it. And so he probably thought it was another one of these little lapses that he has. Sometimes they refer to it as a blank out. A blackout is when you just, collapse completely and you just are completely unconscious. But a blank out is where you're just kind of in this half trance-like state. You're kind of half sleepwalking, but yet you're still doing things. And that's really what Ruby probably thought afterwards when they told him, that he had shot Oswald. But in the remaining time, I like to make a little bit of a comparison between Oswald and Ruby, because of us. And I mean, Jim, you and me and Larry and a lot of other people. Oswald has come a long way. I mean, Oswald is going to be acquitted by history. I have no doubt about that. I mean, I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but his innocence has been established so well that I have no doubt that at some point in the future, the official story is going to completely collapse and it will simply go away. Just like the lies that the Soviet Union told about how the Romanov family died. They tried to hide the fact that the Bolsheviks slaughtered them, all of them, children and all. They lied about the massacre of the Polish officers in the Katan Forest during World War II, tried to blame it on the Nazis when it was really, the Soviets that did it. So these state lies, they collapse, and the one about Oswald is going to collapse too. And Oswald himself, at least, was a good defender of himself. He lived 2 days. And in those 2 days, there are 13 times that I know of in which he very vigorously and vociferously declared his innocence. I didn't shoot anybody. No, sir, I didn't. He said things like that. And even at the midnight press conference, he was a very good advocate for himself. He was the most civilized, the most reasonable person there. In fact, he was making such a good defense of himself that they had to put all kinds of phony noise into the video to make it sound like nobody was paying attention to him. And they had claps and they had noise of sudden doors slamming. They even had a military sound, something like "Attend hut," because they were just creating noise to make it sound like nobody was listening to him. But he did a very good job defending himself. So I always used to say that, Oswald is the man I pity most on earth for having been the most wrong man who ever lived. But I actually feel now that Ruby, in a way, is the most wrong man who ever lived, because at least Oswald got to say he didn't do it. At least he got to say that he was just a patsy. But poor Ruby was so befuddled. He was so confused he was so much in the dark about what really happened that he died not knowing what they did to him, not knowing what happened. And he was completely, totally in the dark. So basically the difference is that Oswald is really on the verge of being vindicated. It's going to take just very little more before the entire story of his guilt is going to just collapse and implode, and he's going to come out of this all right. Whereas in comparison, Ruby, all we've done really is just make a beachhead. You know, we've landed on the beach of Normandy. We've basically secured about 200 yards of beach, but we still have the whole continent of Europe to liberate yet before we're going to get to where Ruby is going to get justice for having been wronged and having been framed and never having shot anybody. And so there's a lot further to go. And like I say, I feel in a way that at least Oswald was standing on his own 2 feet. He got to defend himself. He had 48 hours or nearly 48 hours to declare his innocence, and he did. He did it well. They lost a lot when they failed to kill Oswald in the theater. They hoped to, they planned to. And the thing is, they didn't have anybody in that theater that just was outright, you know, instructed to kill him. Those were cops that they just felt that the pressure of the circumstance and the fact that Oswald was armed, which he was, that would have been enough that somebody would have shot him. And somebody got close. I'm sure that one of those cops holding the rifles, somebody may have done it, but it turned out nobody did. And the result was that Oswald got to live for nearly 2 more days, and he got to advocate for himself, and he did himself a lot of good. And it's one of the reasons why he's come so far. And with our help about exposing the fact that he was standing in the doorway at the time of the shooting and all of the other things, that he is going to get off, and I have simply no doubt about it. And I hope the same is going to happen for Jack Ruby, but he does have a lot farther to go. All we've done is just, lit the first candle for him. There's a lot more work to be done. But in my mind, I want you guys to know that I am just as certain that Jack Ruby was innocent as I am that Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent. And I will leave it at that.
It's fortuitous that he has a champion in you, Ralph, because you've done so much for Lee Oswald. You may be able to replicate your success with Jack Ruby.
We'll see. I'll do my best. But again, there's a lot further to go, and I realize that. But
all right. I agree with that. All right, Ralph Sinkay, you've done a lot for Lee. You've done a lot for Jack, and you've done a lot for the new JFK show. All right. Jim, anything, last words?
No, I think it was really quite remarkable and a wonderful supplement to Ralph's earlier work on this.
Listen, I want to wish you guys the best of luck with your new format on the new station, and I think it's very regrettable that you've been persecuted the way you have, but it's only because you're good at what you do that they're doing it. And I really applaud you for having the determination to just keep going. You found a way to go around them, and I'm going to advance this as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, everyone, we need to push out that we're on 153news.net, 153news.net. And everyone needs to email that to everyone that we know that loves JFK, because that's our new home. All right.
All right, I'll get it up on the Oswald Innocent blog. Thank both of you. Thank you both.
JFK Show number 186. Have a good conference.
Have a good night, man. Thank you.
All right.